I'd like to thank the NTEU. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, and I'd particularly like to acknowledge my political colleagues here and tell you all that this is really hard work, and I admire anybody who's put themselves up to do this, so it's good to be here. It's also good to be here because this is the university where I did my undergraduate and postgraduate studies, and I have great memories of running into the back of the Mickey building at about 6 o'clock at night when the assignment was due at 6:30 and parking illegally so that I could actually get it up to the 7th floor of the Mickey building. And I had a great encounter in this university with sociology and political economy. And if you think that that's just a sort of a nostalgic start, it's not, because I found my experience at this university to be a very profound, life-changing, value-altering experience. And I think that's one of my deepest concerns about universities today, is that the depth and breadth and wisdom of the student experience is being constricted. There's a lot of emphasis on all sorts of things about universities. In my view, not enough emphasis at all on the educational and learning experience that ought to be part and parcel of every student who comes into a university. The first thing, therefore, as far as I'm concerned, is that we really need to go far beyond the rather limited definitions of what universities are about, and particularly in the last decade. Friends, if I hear the word university, economic competitiveness, economic growth, productivity again, so help me, I'll scream. All of those things are important, but they don't limit universities simply to some sort of economic handmaiden of the market. Universities, both now and traditionally, have played a great place in our public life. They add to the economic agenda, but they also add to our culture, and they ought to be adding greatly to our wisdom. They ought to be places of great criticality. Over the last decade, I think I have seen a lessening of that critical role of the university being able to critique the broader community, and particularly to critique some of the paradigms in the broader community. The neoliberal economic rationalist paradigm is not an unchallengeable truth. There are things about our society that if we had picked up a few years ago, for example, a very simple example, if the accountants and the business schools had factored in the real costs of climate change and instructed students, had models which dealt with that, had a criticality about them, then perhaps we wouldn't have produced not generation, but certainly people who lacked the critique of that neoliberal economic model. You know about that as well as I do, so I won't go into that any further, but I do think that we need to restate that a university is a place which has multiple functions, multiple relationships with the community, and it ought not be confined simply to an economic growth, competitive productivity place. The second thing I want to say relates to that, and that is the great challenges of learning and teaching in the universities. When I came to the university, it was a wonderful place because we had opportunities to really engage with staff, and we had wonderful opportunities to engage in collaboration and critique with our colleagues, students. I think over the last few years we have lost that. And we have lost that for multiple reasons. One, funding, which has limited the capacity of universities to really focus in on learning and teaching. And two, the enormous pressures that are now on students via HECS, via having to get part-time jobs. That means that the amount of time students have to devote to their studies is, in my view, significantly less than it was in past years. That must inevitably lessen the learning experience at a university. It means that we are having a greater instrumentalist approach to universities. Instrumentalist in the sense of, do they get us jobs? My view is, yes, that is really important, but it is also important to be producing from universities the critical thinkers of the next generation. That can only come, in my view, from deepening the learning experience at the university. I hope that the Labor Party will direct far more public sector funding into the university sector. You can't dodge that if we are to lessen the pressures on university staff, if we are to lessen the pressures on students, then we need to do something quite radical with increasing funding to the universities. And you know as well as I do that over the last decade, beginning with 1996 when the Howard government slashed 1.9 billion or thereabouts from the university sector, that it's been downhill in terms of university funding. And the recent OECD report, notwithstanding what the coalition government did in the recent budget, the recent OECD reports states very clearly that Australia is way down the bottom end of its commitment to funding for the public sector universities. Labor has made it very clear in its education revolution, which is, hopefully something more than rhetoric. It is a multi-tiered attack on education in Australia from preschool through to universities. I hope that is absolutely matched with a commitment by Labor to fund that exercise, because without that, we won't be able to lessen the pressures on students, to lessen the pressures on staff. There are a couple of specific things that I need to say by way of, just in conclusion, on specific policies. I think that we need to look greatly at the governance arrangements of universities. I think we need to make sure that universities are genuinely independent, which gives rise to freedom of academic research, freedom of academic speech, and a whole range of other issues which are part and parcel of the centrality of what a university is supposed to be about. Governance arrangements have been talked about in this country now for the last couple of years, the last 5 or 6 years. There have been more conventions and meetings about governance, but I've actually witnessed, I think, a greater control over universities through funding mechanisms and less autonomy within the universities. We were asked to come here to speak quite clearly about the RQF framework. Labor is under no illusion, and you should not be. Labor will scrap it, and it will restart the consultation, not restart, but it will accelerate the consultations that it is having now with the tertiary sector about the research quality framework. But it is very clear from the statements that have come from the education people within the Labor Party that the RQF framework won't stand, and we can discuss that later on if you like. There are some other specific measures in relation to early childhood and Labor's new directions with the maths and science programs that I can give you more detail about. But I would conclude by this by saying, I think in the last few years there has been a lessening of the appreciation of the critical role that universities ought to play within our community. There has been a great deal of talk about research. I wish it had been matched by more talk about the quality of the learning experience and the quality of the totality of the university experience, which raises all the questions about how do we fund universities so that all the amenities, all the services, all the reasons that a person would want to stay on a campus to go beyond simply staying in a classroom, that's all in place. I don't want you to think of me as some old person who's just arrived here with a really nostalgic view of universities. That was my experience. I think it was a first-class experience. It wasn't all absolutely rosy, but it did have some of that centrality about collaboration, engagement, and leaving enough time to develop a criticality about the university and about its learning. Thanks.